Hi, it's Robert Schwemmer, and welcome to my channel. As my loyal subscribers know, I explore above and below the water and from the air. There is one story I've been wanting to share with you all: the history, ultimate loss, and the discovery of the former U.S. revenue cutter, later U.S. Coast Guard cutter McCulloch. I was NOAA's chief scientist on the Discovery mission in 2016 in partnership with the U.S. Coast Guard. I modified this presentation for the YouTube video to honor the ship's place in history, the brave men that served on board the ship in war and in peace. June 13th, 2022 marks the 105th anniversary of the sinking off Point Conception, California. McCulloch was named after Hugh McCulloch. He was the 27th, 36th Treasury Secretary, served under 3 presidents, including Abraham Lincoln. So this is the McCulloch as a revenue cutter. It was the largest revenue cutter built in the United States. It was launched in December of 1896, and it actually held that distinction even as a Coast Guard cutter for 20 years until its loss. The cost of $214,000 was basically just the hull. It did not include the ordnance, sails, furniture. So for 1896-97, pretty expensive ship. Very unique in its construction. Was built for the Bering Sea Patrols. There's a famous cutter, a revenue cutter, the Bear. Captain Healy commanded. This was a ship to replace that at some point. But what's really unique about the construction of this ship, during the time period that it would patrol up there in the Arctic and Bering Seas, the charting was limited. We had a lot of information on basic routes, but there were places this ship would go that there were no charts. So they needed to know that this ship could, deal with impacts, groundings, hitting ice. So the stem or the forward part of the ship is a single casting of manganese bronze weighing 14,000 pounds. It was the single largest casting in the United States, and that'll come into play a little later. So McCulloch took its shakedown cruise 23,000 miles from Philadelphia to San Francisco. Okay, why didn't it do 13,000 miles around Cape Horn to San Francisco? They wanted to show this ship off. It was the first revenue cutter to pass through the Suez Canal and Indian Oceans. And when it arrived in Singapore, it was just about the brink of the Spanish-American War. And Commodore Dewey was there with the Asiatic fleet and said, "We want the McCulloch as part of our fleet for an upcoming invasion at the Battle of Manila Bay." So she was the only revenue cutter. All the other vessels were U.S. Navy vessels. McCulloch, in the lower right, El Fraile battery. It was armed at the time. This was a passage. This is April 30th as they're sneaking under the darkness of early morning. And McCulloch has a funnel fire. Flares up, road flare, we're here. So McCulloch takes fire. First shots in the Spanish-American War were shot at the McCulloch. McCulloch returned fire from her aft 6-pound gun. 3 shots. The Concord, the Raleigh, also in the Boston returned fire. Still don't know if McCulloch was the first American ship to fire on Spain, but it was the only ship that suffered a fatality at the Battle of Manila Bay on the American side. And that's Frank B. Randall, chief engineer. He was trying to extinguish the fire. It was 175 degrees in the engine room, and he died of probably heat fatigue as well as a heart attack, they believe. The ship basically was under Commodore Dewey. He said that he didn't want it in the front line because it didn't have the heavy armor. So it was to protect they had a collier there, which is basically their fuel and a supply ship, which was very important to the fleet. So that was her first and major role, and she was also to be right next to the battle scene to tow any vessels that were in distress away, and also look for anybody that's sneaking in from the back door. So very successful in that role. So in the end, we sunk or burned 10 of the Spanish ships. Very decisive battle in the Spanish-American War, the first battle, and wiped out the Spanish Pacific Fleet, and they lost somewhere around, close to 400 Spaniards in the battle. And that's actually McCulloch at the battle, and it was painted gray just prior to entering it. As you can see here, Commodore, now Rear Admiral Dewey, was very pleased with the crew and the ship. So there was one more big role for the McCulloch at the Battle of Manila Bay, basically post-battle, was to take Commodore Dewey's dispatch to Hong Kong, the nearest cable station, and share with the United States government and the world the success of this battle. McCulloch was picked because it could do 17 and a half knots. This was a Greyhound. This was one fast ship, faster than any ship in his flotilla. And it was successful. It returned with orders to promote Commodore to Rear Admiral Dewey. And as you can see with his comments to the Secretary of the Navy, it was just couldn't be prouder than these guys. Finally, McCulloch, via Honolulu, Hawaii, returns to San Francisco, which becomes her duty port. And as you can see by all the headlines, the citizens of San Francisco were very proud that this ship was going to come there. And it just, just one of this famous battle. This was January of 1899. So it had been at sea for a year to do that 23,000 miles and had a battle in between. So here is McCulloch at Sausalito. That's her duty station. She's a first responder. She's inside what is the Golden Gate, of course, pre-Golden Gate Bridge, and she could respond to rescues, customs enforcement, clearing derricks, basically what the Coast Guard does today. They were non-military. They were under the Treasury Department. They also worked with the Life-Saving Service at the time. So her role was between Cape Blanco, Oregon, and down to the Mexican border. Here in 1900, she's now deployed off the Pribilof Islands, of course in the summer months only, to enforce the seal regulations up there. There's a photograph of her with, I think it was like 60-some prisoners, Japanese prisoners that were poaching seals up there. So she served as a floating courtroom. She had a federal judge on board. She was the law. Probably along with the revenue cutter Bear and Manning were up there about the same time. But she could be the taxi, she could be the hospital ship, she could be the rescue ship. They were, the U.S. government, but non-military. Back in 1906, still at Sausalito, June of 1906, a little earthquake, a little fire went on there in town. Well, of course, the people fleeing the city, many went to Sausalito, and under Captain John Canwell, commanding officer, which actually lived in Sausalito up until his death at 81 in 1940. He was part of the community there too, but they helped control the crowds coming in there. The Secret Service is now on board, dispatched out of San Francisco, headed to the Channel Islands, looking for the sealing schooner, aka smuggler, Kate and Anna. They was spotted off Anacapa Island, so they were searching for it. There was no follow-up report that they ever found the ship, but it found real estate on San Miguel Island 1 year later. And there is the Kate and Anna stranded on Kyler Harbor, San Miguel Island. No, that's not the Secret Service, nor the Revenue Cutter Service. These are just passengers passing through San Miguel Island, and the shipwreck was there. It was a great shot. I love that shot. 1909, while McCulloch was at the Battle of Manila Bay, it received the 30-millimeter guns from the Reina Cristina, the flagship, the Spanish flagship, and they were mounted on the McCulloch. And when President Taft came to the port of Los Angeles, he got a 21-gun salute with those guns, and was the first revenue cutter, first ship actually in LA Harbor to salute an American president. And they didn't want McCulloch to leave. They really wanted to have it stationed in LA. This postcard's on eBay for $75 if anybody would like to buy it. A little harsh for me, but it really kind of speaks of some of the enlisted guys that were on board in 1910. And here's a postcard indicating that no other postcards are going to be sent out for a while because they only get paid every 2 months. And so it was kind of fun to get a little of the personal communications. They're from Sausalito. Part of her duties is life-saving. And the Hanley, this is 1914, really sad situation, coming down from Eureka to San Francisco in fog, and goes on Duxbury Reef, which is just north of San Francisco. For 12 to 14 hours, it was getting pounded on the reef, and the ship's breaking up, and you've got, something more of 66 people on board and passengers. Some are going in the water, some are floating on wreckage into the beach where the life-saving service is taking them. And then McCulloch is offshore, and she actually put herself at risk of almost losing the revenue cutter to save 23 lives. And this is just one example off our coast of the rescue she was involved with. So 1914, big change for McCulloch. Still a revenue cutter. Wasn't a Coast Guard cutter till 1915 with the merger of the life-saving and revenue cutter service, and then later the lighthouse service, I think in 1917. But goes into Mare Island Shipyard, Naval Yard, 1913, comes out in 1914, and you can see the mainmast, the middle mast has been removed, which actually McCulloch was the last revenue cutter built with 3 masts. Most of them were built with 2, and can you imagine the soot on the sails being right behind that funnel, especially that funnel that flashes fire? They removed the bowsprit, which I'm sad to see. That was kind of beautiful lines on the ship. And they also replaced the boilers. She was built with 4 coal-burning boilers, and the 2 boilers that went in could burn coal or oil. Not quite the hybrid, but of its time. But up in the Bering Sea and Arctic, they had actually fuel oil up there. So it really made sense that she could have both, capabilities of burning both fuels. Point Conception, June 13th, 1917. McCulloch is now under operational command of the U.S. Navy, still working as a Coast Guard cutter now, because it's 1915 is when they made the conversion. Gets orders to go back to Mare Island and get larger guns. There was talk about her working off Gibraltar. And left San Pedro, headed there. Fog. Yes, they would, blow their fog signals as a warning to other ships. And the governor, 429 people on board, headed from San Francisco to San Pedro, coming near Point Conception. Oh, yeah, there she is. So now you got 2 ships approaching. They hear each other now. And they're going, man, that was close. As soon as that happens, governor is 3 blasts is an indication, full astern. So what does McCulloch do? Answers the call, full astern. And in doing so, they put the helm over to starboard, which going stern opens up her starboard as it swings to port, exposing her bow. But they were trying to create distance behind it, but unfortunately, governor's still got headway. You got this big ship coming out of the fog. Could you imagine just hearing that? There's McCulloch, rare photograph, 100 years ago, June 13th, going down by the bow. 5 lifeboats, she had 8, crew of 90, mostly cuttermen, some were Navy, got off the ship, except the captain was still on board. Captain John Caston Cantwell was walking the deck, looking at the damage, observing things. And then his chief engineer, Glover, says, Captain, you've got to get off the boat. It's going down quicker. And he originally was trying to get a hawse line to the governor to tow it in shallower water so they could salvage the ship, but it was going down. This was 7:30 in the morning. By 8:06, it had disappeared. And he walked over to the boat falls, slipped down into the gig, pulled away, and he witnessed this shot. He describes propeller coming out of the water, the colors still flying as she sunk below the Pacific. We also observed 90 cuttermen and Navy guys standing at attention as their ship went down weeping. And then they were picked up by the governor. And there's 2 more shots before her final plunge. These are the National Park Service up in San Francisco's collection. So here's a contemporary newspaper. It shows, I wish the pictures were better. I'd love to find the originals, but you can see the damage is not so severe to the governor, the angle that it hit. It's about a 35-degree angle. And you can also see a gentleman being taken off the ship, and that is acting water tender John Arvid Johansson. And we'll come to him in a moment. He's severely injured. Actually, when the abandoned ship signal went off, the ship's carpenter heard him moaning from the bow, and he went into the impact area where the governor had struck, and that's where he was in his bunk. And he had been pushed 3 feet away into the icebox with a piece of wood sticking out. They got him off the ship. The captain of Governor was, devastated by the collision, and most importantly, the severely injuring the water tender, and cried. McCulloch comes on the Governor with its crew of 90 to the port of San Pedro. They're offloaded onto the USS Cheyenne, which was a monitor at the time, former battleship, and the USS Oregon, very famous ship in the Spanish-American War that went from San Francisco, 14,000 miles around Cape Horn to Cuba to be involved in the blockade. Things were not happy. At this point, the ship is probably 17, 18 years old. Sailors on the Oregon are just not very friendly to the cuttermen, and they go on strike. We want to get off this ship. So if you want to learn more about the Oregon, there's a past issue of Maritime Currents of the Santa Barbara Maritime Museum. Search for speed in the Santa Barbara Channel. The speed record set for the USS Oregon was between Goleta and Gaviota, along with the USS Olympia, flagship of Commodore Dewey. It was right here in the channel, and there are other USS Charlestons and other ships right out here. And they got some pretty nice bonuses, the shipbuilders. Here is the first indication of the love of this crew from the community of San Pedro. Where did the guys go when they came off the USS Oregon? The Women's Club of San Pedro took them in. Now, what do you like to laugh? No, it was sincere. Bunks, cocks, reading material, cooking utensils, no cost to the U.S. government. Really took care of the shipwreck, sailors or cuttermen, both. And the Naval Reserve Training Center, which was there, is where they reported to duty every day because they were not on vacation. The enlisted guys were digging ditches for sewers, and the officers were doing offshore patrols in World War I while they were holding hearings there on the loss of the ship. So here is our acting water tender, John. I've learned that he was 38 years of age. He died 3 days later in the San Pedro Hospital. His mother lived in Finland. In this letter I found in the National Archives in Washington, D.C. In December indicates he had a sister also in Roxbury near Boston. And I've tried to find the family to share the story with them, but the trail kind of runs out. And then one newspaper indicates he had an aunt in San Francisco. So I was really hoping this news story would bring more family members, but there is one you'll learn about. So this is the Chief of Staff for District 11 Coast Guard. That's 4 states, including Mexico, California, yes, down south, South America, Utah, and so on. I worked directly with him on this mission, and he said, Bob, you got to find where that water tender's buried. And all the contemporary newspapers, big ones, Chronicle, LA Herald, said, he's buried in San Pedro. That's it. They talk a bit about the ceremony, which is really special, but doesn't give me any hint to where. So he really said, LA Long Beach District is important. This is part of their history down there. So, no luck, find a grave, all the usual internet. So I did the old-fashioned way and just started calling cemeteries. And the first cemetery I called was the Harbor View, former Harbor View, believe me, it's apartment view now, Memorial Cemetery. And I checked with the gal there, and I said, do you have a John Alfred Johansson? And so we have a J, middle initial different, Johansson. Let me check another record. Well, then we have a J.A. Johansson, and then let me check another record. The third record gave confirmation. It says, buried June 19th, 1970. I go, that's got to be my guy. Got to be my guy, you know. But of course, I always want two primary sources to confirm this. So I went to the grave site out here. Unfortunately, a lot of the grave markers have been looted over the years. And there was no headstone, but I brought reels and tapes just in case. And this is my friend Linda Benson, Randy Biddle from the LA Maritime Museum Research Society, and we measured off the grave site and found where he was buried and put 6 American flags around there. And I shared some words. This is the San Pedro Hospital where Johansson was for 3 days and died. There's an early picture of the grave site, 1937, when it was a harbor view. And of course, today's 2016 site. And I was told by the cemetery, oh, it's San Pedro Cemetery. Well, obviously it was the harbor view. And my gosh, if you guys know the Gaffey Street in San Pedro, famous Gaffey family, Mrs. Gaffey opened her house to everybody, the survivors. Said, come to my home, come get flowers. So when these guys left the ship, they left with whatever they were wearing or not wearing. And Mrs. Gaffey put a call out 100 years ago to the community, bring cars, we need cars. These guys can't march from the funeral parlor to the grave site for the cemetery. You know, 15 to 20 cars in 1917 showed up, including the chief of police, Goodrich, the funeral parlor provided some, and the Moose's Loyal Order of the Moose did headed up the eulogy at the gravesite because he was a member of the Moose in San Francisco and did visit the Moose Lodge down here in San Pedro. So you had just an amazing turnout, and they talk about the casket covered in all these beautiful flowers, and I tell you, it just, and then 21-gun salute from the sailors off the Cheyenne in their dressed whites. So you had Navy there, you had Coast Guard there, you had the community there. This guy went out in honors. So this is his response from the Chief of Staff. December 7th, I sent him a whole series of photographs, newspaper articles, and as you can see, as a cutterman, which he is, he's commanded many ships, he was very touched by this story, as was my journey. So here's 3 decades of research, well, partial. There's a lot more. I've been working on this for 30 years. Not the only one. Jeff here did his high school paper, first article he ever wrote was on the McCulloch. It was part of this mission and his research. Steve Lawson was on the mission, historian. Ian Williams is the National Park Service, San Miguel Island ranger. He was videographer and just an amazing help. And then, of course, Linda and Randy helping with the research and the cemetery stuff. So it's all volunteers and team effort. So there's where it started. Gary Fabian, sonar expert in Texas. Yeah, Texas. People at sea find up land in interesting places. But he shares his multi-beam target that was taken some years ago. And he said, you know, I think we may have something here. The size is kind of close to McCulloch, and it ties in with a historic record. And I'm going, yeah, this is great. I want more. So I get to be a little optimistic. I'm doing a dive operation in Coho Bay near Point Conception with divers. And we had to return back to San Miguel Island. So I said, well, let's go a little bit out of our way and let's go over the target. And that lower photograph is a fathometer run and shows how much relief off the ocean floor. We got a shipwreck, that's for sure. And what's flying above the shipwreck is not smog, that is fish. So we have habitat. This is not a geologic formation. So Robert Ballard, that found Titanic, his ship Nautilus has been offshore here. And this is where it got more convincing. That is a revenue cutter, Mohawk, Lawson, New Jersey, same year, 1917. Look at those 2 images together. Similar type vessels. I'm going, okay, I think we got the McCulloch. Let's go find it. Started doing my due diligence of research, which means finding ship's plans, which Jeff had. This is 1914 that represents the Refit, the last configuration of the Coast Guard cutter McCulloch. And as you can see, I started identifying what we call diagnostic features of the wreck. You know, what do we need to look for? Well, how about a 15-inch torpedo tube and that manganese bronze bow? Or those 6-pounder guns? And so you start going through, going, okay, I've got my hit list. What next? Next is I approached first the dive locker, which is a diving operations in Alameda for Coast Guard, as well as San Diego. And we started, Joe Irwin, which heads up the whole dive operations. We said, okay, let's put a dive training mission together off the Channel Islands National Marine Sanctuary's research vessel, Shearwater. But we need an ROV that we can launch that can do the currents out there. And Video Ray had just come up with this Mission Specialist ROV. It's very small, challenging in those currents, but he said he could do the currents. And it was free. Free's good. And so we got a team of Coast Guard personnel, National Park Service, volunteers, and the crew of the Shearwater. And I said, the only problem is I can't keep everybody on board because, you know, it's a 5-hour commute. I'd rather stay up there at Coho and just hit it every morning early before the winds come up. And that's where I went back to Chief of Staff, working with our office director, Bill Duros, and we approached Commander. I said, I need a Coast Guard cutter. How many days? So I got on a call with the U.S. Coast Guard, all the captains along the coast with all the cutters. They figured coverage. We could do it with 2 cutters. It was fantastic. And it's a training mission for all of them. It's great. But, you know, they could handle the berthing at night and the feeding. Everybody got your wetsuits on? That's the Coast Guard cutter Halibut. We were actually over the wreck site. As you can see, we can't maneuver.
This is the vessel Shearwater. We restricted our maneuverability.
Captain Terrence Shin.
Operations off Portobello.
That's a GoPro camera in the front. There's one on the bottom. Which, for the visibility we had, which wasn't great, made the difference. Adam with U.S. Coast Guard, Dive Operations San Diego. I don't know who the guy is on the left.
Yep, and he's getting the radio right now too, so we'll take communications that way.
One person can pick it up. It just wants to get wet and go. Watch that thing go. It's like a fish back in the water. Goodbye. Tether and Shipwreck's a challenge, but we did okay.
We are attending at 11 o'clock. Big target on sonar.
ROV pilot, Tom?
See the top, the notch?
Yeah, sir.
That match, get the photos out on the bow. That notch matches up on the upper part of the stem of the torpedo opening.
This is October 2016. Got your Dramamine? That is the torpedo tube. Those are Meridian anemones.
What we're looking at here is the stem post of the Coast Guard cutter McCulloch, and we're holding station on where the torpedo opening is, the forward stem. It's built out of a single casting of manganese bronze, and that's the first artifact that we came to, very diagnostic of Coast Guard cutter McCulloch.
Pull that carry in.
Basically just ID'd the shipwreck in 1 minute.
There is the 6-pounder gun on starboard in the bow. Does that speak of the Battle of Manila Bay? That is the helm from the Flying Bridge. Non-ferrous metal because it was on the weather deck. The handles have succumbed to the teredo worms. That looks like a shipwreck.
So what we're finding is McCulloch sitting on the seafloor, listing on our port side. We're still up in the bow area. We've established the 15-inch torpedo opening in the forward stem. We've identified anchors, windlass for the anchor, capstan. What we believe is a 6-pounder gun in the sponson. We've located other various grand tackle associated with the anchoring.
This skylight is huge, and you can see double portholes for ventilation on the side and on the top. And that's because we had a GoPro camera looking down. Some of the stuff we'd fly right over if it wasn't for, picking up the footage later and then going back. And that would be right over that engine room where he was fighting the fire near the stack. And I bet those vents were open that day. There is that 2,500 horse triple expansion, the original engine put down by William Crampton's son that could drive that ship at 17.5 knots. Maybe with the fuel oil faster. Yes, the faucet still drips. That's a porthole to the left in a frame. It's interesting that those frames with the portholes would go fit right into, I guess, the wood frames above deck. So like say this is a composite hull, it's wood over steel frames, which was an effort, if they'd ever grounded, they could fix versus having a steel hull that could be catastrophic. Well, you called that the birdcage for a while until we went back to the historic record and found out about this non-ferrous metal ventilator. It was over the officers' quarters. And of course, that's an 11-foot propeller, and there's where the sediment is. And there's a vermilion fish on this. So the discovery was, pretty amazing, especially when we looked at the sonar image and thought we were looking at the bow, and the current was blowing southerly, and the bow was also pointing, so we knew we could approach the bow first, and if that wasn't in the sediment, we could find that torpedo tube. And it was just, we saw the outline with the Mediterranean anemones before we saw the artifact. Lingcod guarding the anchor. Just a terrific, everything just worked, weather worked, the crew was just amazing. Great group of guys from Coast Guard and Park Service, LA Maritime Museum Research Society. So people say, well, what was that exciting moment? I said, well, of course, the discovery of the wreck was very exciting. This is where I got real emotional this is what I wanted. I wanted a tribute. That's the Dolphin 6570, came out of Point Magoo. And there's the halibut, paying tribute over the wreck side on the eve of the 100-year anniversary, the sinking of the U.S. Coast Guard Cutter McCulloch. That was so moving. You saw basically the 15-inch torpedo tube. This is kind of an image if it turned upright. As you can see, there's a drastic list of port, the angle to the left of what we see today on the seafloor. I just kind of straightened it out to show its orientation to the original configuration pre-loss. Same thing, there's that bowsprit, which I plugged. That was just above where the torpedo tube was. And there's the chain trailing from the hawse hole and pipe with the cap and went right up on deck, right to the anchor, as it should, because the ship was not anchored. It was moving at the time. And that's the manganese bronze bow, but those are fasteners. That's what kept the outer planking attached to the ship below the waterline. And that's the top of the ship, right there up on the bow. And you can see, again, that angle. And there's the 6-pounder gun, starboard side, as we saw earlier in the video. And then I did the orientation of moving it as it would pre-loss. Have that thing aimed at you. And that sponson is like a gun turret, so it could swing quickly. And there is the gun inside a sponson, you can see. So that's the inside the hull of that same gun. And up in the forward area of the forecastle, I'd still like to go in there and explore. We're kind of in that area where our water tender was bunking. And there's a capstan, which connects down to the anchor windlass, which is right there, where there's the base of the capstan. And chain's still there, going to the anchor. Speaking of anchors, the one lashed to the deck has in the plans, per the plans, it's still lashed on the deck. And these are skylights. They're all over the deck of the ship, and of course they're all over the wreck now because they're non-ferrous and glass. They've survived, and they basically provided light to the lower decks when the sun was up. And of course we saw the helm, our steering station, and flying bridge. But we also found the helm and the pilot house, which is inverted here. And you can see all that remains is a non-ferrous hub because it was wood. And that is all, again, Teredo worms have consumed that. And that would connect to the helm up above, so you could steer from either station. And heating coils, steam coils, provide heat, especially when you're up in the Arctic and Bering Sea areas. Big ventilators. These things are also non-ferrous, brass, bronze. Well, they spared no expense. Of course, you saw the engine skylight, triple expansion steam engines at the top of the cylinders there. And bottles. So we're starting to see a little bit associated with the crew. At first, I thought it was more ceramics, and on one of the passes, I saw some of these little brass tabs and realized these are old batteries. And this is actually a battery recovered from a shipwreck, the state of California, up in Alaska. And there's another gun, another 6-pounder. This is on the port side, back aft. So the one on the opposite side was the one that fired at El Fraile Battery, the Battle of Manila Bay. And guess what? There was shells. Those are the 3-pounder shells below deck there between the guns. And I didn't even see it. Again, GoPro camera attached to the bottom, looked and went, oh, we got to go back. Still in the boxes. And I have the inventory of everything went down with the ship, which helped me determine what guns were still on board. And of course, you saw the sink and then again that frame with a porthole back in the officers' quarters. And then the bird cage, ventilator. And you can see the wheel inside as it's described when they were building this for the ship. A lot of specifications had to be built, but it had to have a crank to open it and ventilate. And there's the wheel inside. And this is a sounding machine. Of course, they needed to know the depth of the water when they're up there in these uncharted areas. And they also did survey work up there. Probably worked with the Coast and Geodetic Survey back then. And there's that propeller. Look at the sediment. That's an 11-foot propeller, and you're only seeing the top of one of the blades. So that's how much sediment there is back in the stern. And part of the bow is also under sediment. And you can see this attachment point, again, very diagnostic of McCulloch, where they could actually lift if they needed to. It looked like original design was with a chain, but here it had a cable that goes into the sediment, but they could lift it right out of the gudgeons and pennels. They just lift it right up if they needed to. And speaking of which, there's kind of like the hinge of the rudder. And there is still some hull structure back in the stern area. We actually went inside that part. That's where we saw the ventilator in the top of the rudder stock. ceramics throughout the wreck site. Didn't see any logo ceramics. But again, it speaks to the crew. Lots of marine life. This is Rear Admiral. Todd he's the commander of all of District 11, and we asked the Coast Guard to do the press release under their letterhead and just use our products because this is their ship to honor. And so I went up to San Francisco, and Admiral and I, now he's an upper Rear Admiral, he just got another star. The two of us told the story and did the press release, and in San Francisco at the Maritime Museum where those historic photos were. Talking about the important human history, which these ships are, the society on board, all these battles are fought with the men, not the ship. You know, that's the vehicle to get there and the men that operate it. And it's very important to me to tell their stories, and that's, to me, the living history. How he just happened to be in LA area from Corvallis, Oregon, and I'll let him tell the rest of the story here.
I truly hope you enjoyed this video on the history, sinking, and discovery of the U.S. Coast Guard Cutter McCulloch. I'm pleased to announce the shipwreck site was added to the National Register of Historic Places, honoring the brave men that served aboard at the Battle of Manila Bay, Bering Sea Patrols, and the Pacific Coast World War I patrols throughout its 20-year career, both in the U.S. Revenue Cutter Service and U.S. Coast Guard. Please like this video if you enjoyed it, and if you're not a subscriber, I certainly hope you might consider joining me on future journeys above, below, the sea, and from the air. Thank you.